So now that we've done some work in the library module, let's go ahead and take a look at the develop module. So here you can see we still have a film strip down the bottom where we can look at some of our pictures. But for each picture we have many more and much more nuanced editing controls. So before the exposure was just clicks, now we can really fine tune it to whatever we want. Oops, just misclicked there. I'll reset that for now. If you're interested in key commands, I will post a separate link with some useful keyboard shortcuts. I believe you can also, in the help section, if you type shortcuts, that's something different, never mind that. I will post a separate thing about keyboard shortcuts. One important one to know, because it can create a lot of trouble if you click it by accident, is the tab key will make your panels disappear, shift tab will make everything disappear, and clicking tab or shift tab again will bring all those palettes back. It can be useful if you find them distracting. You can also make palettes go away by clicking on these tabs, and this is true in the library module as well as the develop module. It's true for all of them. Another key command that's useful because you might hit it by accident or it might be useful to you is the F key. Will change you to a full screen view if you want to just show pictures to your friend or a client or something like that. And pressing F again takes us out of that view. So on this side we have our history, we have collections, which are kind of like virtual folders. We haven't made those yet. Snapshots, which I will come back to, and then presets. I generally don't want you to use these getting started in the course, but you might decide you find these interesting in the future. So for instance, let's see if there's any good ones here. So like in the effects, we can have like vignette 1 or rounded corners, white. It's kind of like the types of effects you would normally see on a mobile app for editing pictures. It's nice to have them there, but we're going to try to use a more intentional mode of editing. So here, the first thing we have is white balance, and I will select a picture that has something neutral in it. So this is an interesting white balance challenge in this picture because we know that bones are sort of white, but they're really off-white. In this case, I know that the background is a neutral color, so by using this neutral color picker tool, this eyedrop, I can click here, and now the bone has just like that little yellow tint, which is accurate to its color. You can also tweak the color by just changing the temperature between yellow and blue, or changing the tint between green and magenta. I'm going to reset everything on this picture again. And there's also presets, so you can set it for daylight. Tungsten is indoor lights. Flash. Automatic. And as the camera made it as shot. Up here we have some tools. We will leave We'll leave most of these tools alone for now. They're for more advanced target image editing. This first tool here is called the crop tool, and it allows you to crop just like you would in other imaging programs. Hit escape on that. The thing that might be a little different from the crop tool is you have a few functions here. You have this lock option, which keeps the picture at the ratio it was photographed at. If you unlock the picture, you can crop it to any shape you want. And if you choose custom ratios like 1:1, which is square, then you can change the size, but it'll keep you set on that ratio. And I'm going to just press escape, which is going to cancel that function. This histogram up here, this range of data, shows us the range of colors and tones in the picture. So because this is a very simple picture, it's kind of a gray on gray, we don't really expect to see much information there. So I'll open kind of a more normal, for lack of a better term, photograph. So here we can see the peak of our information is mostly on the left side, which is a good indicator that this picture is probably a little underexposed. So if I bring this exposure tool, you can see that starts to center. We get another problem though, which is you can see things are kind of climbing way in the white edge. These little triangles here will create what's called clipping warnings. So you can see when I turn this on, it shows that the highlights have become so bright that they no longer have editable information in them. So that is a clipped highlight. And that's not just an editing issue, that also happens from overexposure in your camera. Shadow clipping is also enabled, and that will be represented blue. So if I bring down the exposure, we start to see that blue creep in. Clipping warnings are useful, but they can also be distracting from the image, so sometimes you want to turn them off. In this case, we can see that the clipping is in the highlights, so we can go down to this highlight slider and just bring that down until all those clipped edges go away. We can also bring down the whites to bring it down a little more. You can also affect these functions by actually dragging on the histogram itself, which is pretty cool. Now, before I move on, as I mentioned before, this is a non-destructive image editor, and here we can see a history of everything done to the image, and we can cycle through that and it'll show it all to us. If I like this edit but I want to try other things, I can create a snapshot. So I'll call it demo1, and that snapshot is now saved in here for this file. So now if I've worked on this file a lot more, maybe I brightened up the shadows, boosted the contrast, but I decide weeks later perhaps that I liked my original edit, I can go back to this snapshot demo1 and it'll take it back to that edit. So really the best way to understand these tools is to just play with them, but we can see blacks really tweaks those very dark tones, and white tweaks those very bright tones. One approach to editing pictures that can work pretty well is to start with the blacks and whites and then manipulate the highlights and shadows. So exposure and contrast will affect your overall brightness and your darkness of blacks and whites, and you might be able to get all the adjustments you want right there. But here's just another approach that we're going to look at. So here I'm going to enhance the whites, and darken the blacks such that I only have a little bit of clipping. And then I'll brighten the shadows and lower the highlights until hopefully most of that clipping goes away. And this way I've kind of taken a more methodical approach to optimizing the contrast. And I might then take that file and just up the exposure a little bit. So now we've got a lot of brightness and definition with that file, and we've retained a lot of information. I'm going to reset that again. So down here we have clarity, vibrance, and saturation. So saturation will make your colors richer and deeper. You can see if I turn it all the way down, the picture turns black and white, though this is not the best way to make a black and white picture. Vibrance, you'll see, has a similar effect turned up, perhaps a little more subtle, and turned down, we still see a little color. Vibrance will kind of amplify majority tones and desaturate minority tones in your color range. And it can be very useful if you have a slightly weird color cast in your picture. Dropping the vibrance a little can take that away. Or if you've taken a picture outside and you just want to give it a little more oomph to the colors, I think oomph is the technical term there, you can just increase the vibrance a little, and it just has a little bit more of a natural look than the saturation tool. Clarity increases contrast on edges, which kind of creates a sharpening effect. Now I've cranked it up way too high here, and the issue with local contrast and sharpening tools, which are very similar, is that they don't have any depth perception. So the clarity looks great on the balloons, but the background now has become kind of distracting because it's over sharpening the out of focus parts of the image. I never really use negative clarity, but you can see that kind of gives a nice glowy effect. In general, I'd say if you're using the clarity tool, just consider 50 the speed limit on that tool, because even if things look good in the moment, they tend to look over-processed when you give the picture a second look. So if you are going to affect clarity, which affects edge contrast, it's a good idea to do it before you make other adjustments to the picture. So now that I've done the clarity adjustment, I can affect the exposure and the shadows. So I'm going to open the shadows, which are sort of the darkish tones, and then drop the blacks a little bit, which are like the darkest tones. Then maybe do the same thing with dropping the highlights a little. You can really see what the highlights do on that gold balloon. It just gets so much more information on it. And maybe increase the whites a little just to give the picture a little more brightness, but we've got that information there retained because we dropped the highlights. So if I decide I love these edits, I may want to apply this exact set of edits to these other balloon pictures as well. And the way to do that is I can hold Shift and select those other pictures, hit this option here, Synchronize, and now I can choose all the options that I want to sync or that I don't want to sync between these files. Generally, you would just sync everything. And now all these pictures have the same bright, saturated look to them. Now, on a more conceptual note, when editing pictures, there's kind of, for me, there's two main approaches. There's a preference for drama or a preference for information, is the way I think about it. When I edit a picture, usually the first thing I try to do is just maximize information. So that means essentially try to avoid all clipping and try to have as much information in the picture readable. So here I may want to drop, in the spirit of information, I may want to drop the highlights even further so that the highlights on this balloon don't turn white. That being said, when I think about drama or just the overall aesthetic impact, I actually think that the slightly brighter contrast is better. We don't see that crinkly information here. A little information is lost, but we have a much better sense of the sun reflecting off shiny balloons, which is really what the picture is about. So you always have to make a decision between those two things. But I think that starting with information is a good way to just you could think of it as the objective versus subjective as well. Starting with maximizing information is a good way to just kind of see everything that's in your file. So now we're going to look at some slightly more advanced options you have in the editing section. So here we have the tone curve, which I'm actually going to skip for now. It's a great tool. We're going to use it extensively in Photoshop, but I'm going to leave that for now. Here, and you can see that if there's tools you're not using, you can collapse those with a little triangle. This palette here is called the Hsl palette, and it's extremely powerful. So Hsl stands for hue, saturation, and luminance. So let's just start with saturation. So you can see here we have red, orange, yellow, green, aqua, blue, purple, and magenta represented. So let's say I like my overall color tone in this picture, but I think that this purple balloon is just a little oversaturated. Now, if I use the overall saturation tool, I lose color in my red balloon too. I'll undo that. Undo, by the way, is Command-Z or Control-Z on Windows, like every other program. So here I want to leave the red alone, but I want to bring down the saturation on the purples, and I can just do that. I can go down to the purples and increase or decrease the saturation there as much as I want. You can really see it if I go to the greens. See those greens coming in and out. Maybe I'll increase the greens a little just to make this picture kind of hyper colorful. Now, hue will affect the overall tint of each color. So perhaps I think that this red here is too pink. So I can select the reds. You can see I can make the red very pink, or I can make the red very yellow. Now, in addition to selecting on the sliders, you can also use this little picker tool. And you can select a tone in the picture and then just drag up and down to select that tone. And you can see the blue and purple sliders are moving together because those are the two sliders that influence that color. So this is a way you can make pretty sophisticated targeted adjustments on your pictures without selecting or masking anything. Another very useful function for this is if you've perhaps photographed indoors and you have light coming through a window and also from a light bulb. So you have some warm light and some cool light. You can use the white balance to correct for one light and then reduce the saturation of the other tone. So for instance, if you correct for the indoor lighting, the sunlight coming through the window might look a little aqua, and you can reduce the saturation there. Luminance will affect the brightness of that tone. So I can make this balloon really bright, or I can make the balloon much darker. And I think that the darker balloon actually gives us a lot more definition. And again, with all these tools, you can use this picker to select a specific tone and then drag up and down on that tone. And there is a little spillover because we're selecting colors, not objects. So you can see when I brighten the gold balloon, it affects the grass a little bit. The balloon's reflecting a little green in it. It's not a surprise. All palettes in Lightroom have a little switch to turn them off. So I can turn off all the Hsl settings or turn them back on. I should also mention in this tool that we can have this all option, in which case it just shows us our hue, saturation, and luminance all in one interface. If you are converting to black and white, this is also the best tool for that because it allows you to individually choose how bright or dark colored things in the scene should be. So here I'm moving the reds, and you can see that that red balloon can be very bright or it can be almost black. Split toning is kind of an interesting effect, not one that we'll use that much. It just adds kind of a little tint. So here we've added a blue tint to the highlights and an orange tint to the shadows. It looks pretty weird in this picture, but let's try it on this scene here. We can add well, let's do a yellowish orange to the highlights and a blue to the shadows. And you can see it looks a lot like an Instagram filter. I can't remember which one. Adding blue to the shadows and orange to the highlights will just enhance apparent contrast. It's a very common technique in movie color grading. So we can tweak the hues on these things, tweak the saturation to make it more subtle or extreme. Generally, though, this is what I would think of as a stylized effect, which probably won't be appropriate for most of the assignments in the class. So I'll just flip that off for now. Here in the details section, we can affect sharpness and noise reduction. So you can see that this little box shows us a 100% zoom. If I change the sharpness of the image, so I'm just going to crank it way up, you don't really see a difference in the preview. You only see a difference in this window here. If you click on the preview, it's now zoomed in, and it shows us here to 1:1, and now you'll see the effect. So here I'll drop the sharpening to 0, and I'll put it all the way up, and you can see it really makes a difference. So generally you don't want to use too much sharpening. I can also increase the radius, which is kind of how wide a net it's casting on the edges. It adds definition to. I actually never add sharpening to my pictures. I usually just leave them at the default. Hold the Option key down, which allows me to reset just this section. And the reason for that, the reason I leave sharpening at the default is, again, it's a two-dimensional tool. It doesn't understand that this is out of focus. So while it looks pretty good to boost the sharpening on these veins on this leaf here, this object starts to look, especially if I crank up the radius too, kind of, the out of focus stuff starts to look kind of unnatural. I don't know if these effects show that well on video, so you might want to experiment with them a little bit yourself. Here, looking at this image, because it's got some shadow, I think that this area in the sky will be a good place to see some of the noise. I guess this image doesn't have that much noise. Let me find one with noise. So I'm going to zoom in even further on this image, if it will let me, or I guess it's just zooming to 1:1 right now. In noise reduction, we have two types of noise reduction, color and luminance. So by default, Lightroom will apply some color noise and it'll leave the luminance alone. So if I turn this all the way off, I don't know if you can see it very well on the video, but there's kind of like some magenta and cyan little speckles all over the place. I encourage you to look at this on a high ISO picture of your own. If I crank up the color noise reduction, that distracting false color disappears. Now, there is still a little bit of grain here, and if I use luminance noise reduction, that grain will just disappear. Now it's silky smooth. The problem is that the in-focus part of the picture also becomes silky. So these little hairs on the mint leaves are starting to get kind of a little weird and blurry. If I turn the noise reduction off, you can see there's a lot more sharpness on the leaves here. So a little noise reduction can help, but again, nothing's for free, and these tools tend to come at the cost of other things in your image. So here we have lens correction. I don't think that we're going to see much of an effect, maybe on this one here. Generally, the big difference between cheap lenses and expensive lenses is that cheap lenses are dark and distorted in the corners. So there's still merit to nice lenses, but using these profile lens corrections, Lightroom has essentially analyzed everything wrong with most lenses and it fixes it. So here it brightens up the corners, so it's now even across the frame. You'll really see a difference if you use the wide angle on your zoom lens. It'll change the distortion dramatically. These transform tools we're not going to use now, and we'll also leave these special effects tools.